I would like to introduce you to Anya Schiffrin, who's the Director of Technology, Media and Communications at the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. She teaches courses on media development and innovation, as well as the course Media, Human Rights and Social Change. Among topics she writes on is journalism and development, as well as media in Africa. She has been focusing on the extractive sector, and she's been working 10 years overseas as a journalist in Europe and in Asia. And she was a Knight Baggot Fellow at Columbia University School of Journalism from 1999 to 2000. She is on the global board of the Open Society Foundation and the advisory board of the Natural Resource Governance Institute and the American Assembly. Her most recent book, you will see above us here, is called African Muckraking, 100 years of investigative journalism from around the world. I would like you to introduce you to Joseph Stiglitz, University Professor at Columbia University, the winner of the 2001 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics, and lead author of the 1995 IPCC report, which shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. At Columbia, Stiglitz co-chairs the Committee on Global Thought and is founder and co-president of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue. His latest book, People, Power and Profits, Progressive Capitalism for an Age of Discontent, will be released next month. As we are here with you who are journalist students, I'll ask Anya a few questions on journalism to begin with. And in your book, Anya, Global Muckraking, you have investigated 100 years of investigative journalism from around the world. What would you say are the value of investigative journalism through these 100 years?
I'll be happy to. First of all, who in the room knows who the muckrakers are? Raise your hand if you know who the muckrakers were. Anybody heard of them? Besides Roy? Okay. One person? Who? Okay, yes, you? Could you tell us? Tell the class who the muckrakers were, please.
What muckraking means, or?
Either. What it means or who the muckrakers were, to start with.
Or did he dig something out of the ground, which is, or maybe I'm confusing something.
They dig up dirt, yeah.
They dig up dirt.
Exactly. And what else? What else do they do, the muckrakers? Did I see a flash of recognition? Who are the muckrakers?
I was in the class last year when you had the lecture.
Yeah, great. That's okay. So you remember. That's good.
Yeah. So it's digging the muck, it was the name of investigative journalists digging up something that was dirty, that was not supposed to be.
Anybody have anything to add? One of the men who's on their laptops, either of you? Do you remember anything about the muckrakers? You weren't Googling? No? Nobody? Muckrakers? Okay. The reason I ask is my publisher told me I had to call the book Muckraking because he said everybody knew the muckrakers. And it turns out nobody knows the muckrakers, except once in Korea I was teaching in a PhD class in Seoul at National University. And I said, who knows who the muckrakers are? And everyone raised their hand. And I said, why are you the only people in the world who remember the muckrakers? And they got very insulted and said, well, we're PhD students. Obviously we know who the muckrakers were. So the muckrakers were, so now I have to begin every talk explaining who the muckrakers were. The muckrakers were a group of journalists that existed in the US for about 10 years, between 1905 and 1915. There were about 15 of these journalists, and they wrote for mostly about 3 different magazines. And that period of history was sort of similar to our period today. There were enormous greedy banks, railway companies that were knocking people off land, terrible overcrowding in the cities, and huge gaps between rich and poor, big inequality problems. And for a whole lot of reasons, including changes in the way that printing was done, changes, a growth in subscription instead of advertising, which made journalists freer in some ways. One editor who kind of cultivated the muckrakers. We wound up with a small group of journalists called the muckrakers, and they were called the muckrakers by Teddy Roosevelt, who used them sometimes to put forward his messages, but also hated them other times. And so they wrote about food safety, they wrote about slums, they wrote about how awful the big oil companies were, they wrote about cities, they wrote about local corruption. And so they've kind of become, for journalists, and if you're studying journalism, you have to know about them, they've kind of become a gold standard. And in America, when someone does a great job of journalism, we say, oh, they're like the muckrakers. Or if you go to the Global Investigative Journalism Network conference, they always have a discotheque on Saturday night, and the band is called the Muckrakers. So the Muckrakers have kind of seeped into the lexicon. And what I was trying to do in my books was sort of de-Westernize that and look around the world and see all the places in the global south where people were doing muckraking, but they had been completely forgotten about because we always think of these 15 Americans. So Africa Muckraking is the first time that anyone's brought together all of the investigative journalism from Africa in one book and gone back as far as I could, which was 75 years. And Global Muckraking takes all this investigative journalism from like 30 countries and goes back 150 years. And so the idea was to see what all these journalists had in common and how did different countries deal with the same problems. So, for example, trafficking of women, right? This is a subject that everyone thinks about now. Guess when I found an article about trafficking? How far back did that go? Any guesses? What was the first one that I could find? 1868 in India. Things like chocolate, conditions on the cocoa plantations. Huge problem. Journalists still write about it today. You know, I found an article from 1903. And a huge consumer boycott, by the way. So all these things that we think of as new, you know, pressing advertisers, boycotting, shareholders, newspapers, activism, public meetings, all of this was happening for a couple of hundred years. So that's really kind of the context. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's sort of the context of what this global muckraking is. And, you know, for me, when I think about it, it's really journalism in the in the public truth, writing about things that really matter, not writing about celebrities, obviously digging deep, looking at social problems. And there's so many journalists around the world today who are still doing this kind of journalism, you know, people like Craig. And there's usually just a couple of them in many societies. They're not a big group. And so I just call them still the global muckrakers. Other people call them, you know, different things like the vanguard journalists.
On the sleeve of your book, the journalists are referred to as crusading journalists.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
So many of the kind of work the muckrakers do wouldn't make it into the New York Times because it's very often the muckrakers saw a problem and they just kept doing journalism until they felt they had fixed the problem. So these often weren't necessarily even journalists. They were people like E.D. Morel, who was actually in business, or a whole lot. There's a whole category of them that weren't journalists, but they saw something terrible, and so they were so angry they wrote a book or they started a newsletter. So it was definitely they were doing advocacy for sure, and sometimes they were teaming up with NGOs and getting help or money from the NGOs, which still goes on today, but it's not what we think of as sort of conventional journalistic, nonpartisan, ethical standards. So these were engaged people. These were activist journalists in many cases, not all, but many. But even so, they had a complete commitment to truth-telling and to verification and to fact-checking. So they weren't lying, they weren't creating disinformation, but they were crusading, but in a very rigorous scientific method, I would say, or methodology. Mm-hmm.
You also have an article in another book, Making Transparency Possible, Interdisciplinary Dialogues, which was released yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
And there you write about that, you ask if donor-driven use of digital technology makes it different. Could you explain what you mean by donor-driven?
Sure. Well, I guess you all know, you probably learned about this already, that there's a lot of foundations and philanthropists and governments around the world that are funding journalism. So a lot of it comes out of the foreign aid budgets of places like Sweden or Canada or Norway. And they're doing a whole lot of things in the Global South, everything from funding journalism schools, funding media outlets, training journalists. So one of the things that the donors have been doing in the last 10 years is trying to sort of foster a culture of innovation in newsrooms. So people like the Knife Foundation or the Gates Foundation or Omidyar have been giving lots of money to train journalists in how to do things like coding, how to do data journalism, how to do and this is relevant for you because when you think of why all these journalists are doing these cross-border collaborations, a lot of it is because the technology has changed, right? You can now have these enormous servers where you can go in and work together on same sets of data and you find ways to collaborate. So my observation in that chapter was that a lot of the sort of data journalism in Africa had been paid for by the donors, which was a good thing because it made all these wonderful, interesting investigative stories appear. But it was a bad thing in that the main problem a lot of journalists in Africa face and around the world is they don't have enough of an audience and they don't have enough money for their outlets. And this wonderful emphasis on the bells and whistles and the data journalism didn't really solve that problem. In the US, we call it abandonware. That's when like Knife Foundation pays for some fabulous new app so you can like see when all the trees being cut down in the Amazon and then they go away and nobody ever uses it again. We call that abandonware. Yeah, so that's what I was talking about. Should we bring Joe into the conversation?
We can do that.
Yeah.
We are talking about access to information and also the audience, which perhaps is missing a little bit. Why is access to information so important to develop societies from an economist perspective?
I think access to information is important for everything. I mean, maybe I look at next year I get my Nobel Prize in, so maybe I think everything through that lens. But there are particular issues where it becomes particularly important to follow up what Anya talked about. One of the big issues is corporate and public governance. If we used to think if you could just make sure that people knew what was going on, people would not steal from the public. We talk about corruption in public, but there's also a lot of corruption in the private sector. CEOs that steal from the company, and but if you had good information, people would be held accountable. Accountable is about information, and that would lead people to behave in ways that are in accordance with what the way they're supposed to behave. I think we now are facing particularly with the arrival of Trump, not sure exactly whether that's true, or to put it another way, information is necessary, but people have to process that information. And so there's been a lot of good journalism in the United States in the last 2 years about corruption in the Trump administration, in department after department, but it doesn't seem to have much of an effect.
Yeah, and this is the block that we're running in, where all these journalists are feeling so sort of shocked that they work so hard on doing these incredible investigative stories, and then they put it out, and it's like nothing happened. And we were talking with Craig a little bit about this in South Africa. And then the scientists and the academics feel really depressed because how many million studies do you need showing that climate change exists? And yet these people just decide, oh, it's fake news, and decide to ignore it no matter how many people and young people will be affected. So we're a little bit like, I think everyone right now in the US that's looking at journalism is just slightly shocked. We thought that naming and shaming and information had power, and now we just don't know what to think. I mean,
yeah. So, I mean, part of it is the fundamentals of scientific method. There's always some degree of uncertainty. We don't know for anything for sure. But when you have 9,000 or 900,000 studies that say something big is happening on climate, and you have one that says, or five that says, well, maybe it isn't so big, the wealth of knowledge is overwhelmingly that there's something real going on. And we all know about, statistical probabilities, things, data is sometimes wrong. So, we inculcate in our students this probabilistic view. But it's very clear that that kind of uncertainty, but certainty, I mean, it's almost surely true, is not something that we've succeeded in teaching. So that's one problem. But the other problem is a more cognitive problem, that people reframe when they see another department in, the Department of Interior involved in corruption, or one department after another, they reframe it as everybody does this. And then, but of course, everybody doesn't do that. And so the question then becomes, which is really, in a way, the question of all journalism: how do you get people's attention? That you don't think about it that much, but you always want to write an interesting story. You don't want to write a story that nobody reads. So it's not just telling the story; it's telling it in a way that grabs people. And the question is how you do that in a world in which there may be cynicism, in which there are people who, I'll give you another, one of the, I was in the Clinton administration, and, we did this consciously, but what we did occasionally has become almost an art form. So if there was ever bad news, we would wait a day, and the next day we'd say, oh, that's old news. So the fact that it was old news didn't mean that it was any better, but, somebody had done something wrong. We waited a day, then we said it was old news, and we tried to recharacterize it as, oh, you don't really want to pay attention to that because, that's old. But when every day is old news, how do you break through and say, actually, this is not old news. It is really news that somebody is stealing from the government every day. That so trying, there's a real battle going on
For attention.
and for, you might say, non-attention. One side is trying to paint a picture to try, to persuade people not to pay attention.
Well, I was just thinking how when you talked about old news, did everyone follow the testimony when Trump's lawyer, Michael Cohen, testified against Trump, right? You've all been watching that. And then the Republicans said, well, nothing there was new. And we're like, oh, okay, so you knew all along that Trump was a liar, a cheater, a fraud, and a harasser. That's not new. Got it. What are you saying isn't new, right? That was your point, totally.
And if that is true, it's a really bad thing that your president is a bigot, a liar. The fact that it's old news and accepted doesn't mean that you shouldn't do something about it.
Yeah, so this in a way is the challenge of journalism, is how do you keep reminding people of stuff that's old, right? This is part of the subject of the Global Muckraking book. Okay, there's been trafficking of women for hundreds and hundreds of years. There's been famine for hundreds of years. There's been corruption for hundreds of years. How is it that sometimes people really care and do something about it? They get rid of Zuma. or they vote in a Trump. Why at certain periods of history does this information suddenly have an impact? So that's really part of what I tried to explore in my book, and trying to understand the different cases. There's lots. I'm always trying to think of, can we come up with sort of rules? And some people have done that. But I mean, one thing that's totally clear is one piece of journalism is pretty much never enough. So you always have to go back and do it over and over again. Often you have to sort of package it up into little pieces rather than one big story. This latest piece on Trump's tax returns, that was 20,000 words. Everybody was so busy that week worrying about other things that the New York Times didn't actually get that much attention. And everybody sort of said to them, if you had done several stories over several weeks, that would have helped. And if you had done what Craig does and ICFJ have done, which is share it with other outlets, that would have helped as well. Because part of the impact that Panama Papers has had, right, is that it was so many different outlets covered it from so many different angles for so many weeks, and they did that obviously on purpose because they knew that would help them get impact, which I'm sure you talked about in the class.
Yeah, one other thing, there's been a lot of research in behavioral economics and in marketing, trying to figure out what makes people pay attention to something. What do they react to? And I'm not sure how much of that research has really been absorbed into journalism as part of you might say a scientific methodology to get attention. Let me give you one experiment that illustrates in a quite different context where they did an experiment, a random controlled experiment on getting, I think these were, I'm not quite sure, I can't remember exactly, but AIDS patients, for instance, to take medicine on a regular basis. And there were two different ways they did it. One was to send them a message, every day, and another one was to send them a message once a week. And they also did a control about a short message versus a long message about how there were lots of people who loved you, and that if you die it won't be very good for your friends and all that. So they tried to vary it in a various way, and the main result was the length of the message didn't make any difference. The content didn't make any difference, but getting it every day didn't help at all. People just absorbed it into the background. But once a week turned out to be very effective, that it actually changed behavior. So I don't, but that's the kind of thing that sort of, that people, certain kinds of noise, they just absorb as background, and then there's certain things that really jar them.
Yeah.
And trying to figure out, what's the optimal frequency, the optimal way of jarring people, is something that one ought to look at more carefully.
That's really interesting. I mean, I think one problem is the people that have done that have been like, BuzzFeed, and they just do it for a lot of the schlocky news. Although they've done some, Mike tried to sort of take progressive news and make it go viral. But anyway, there's questions, right? Did I see you stirring? Who wants to ask?
I also wanted to ask you a little bit about the progressive capitalism for age of discontent. I think that's a descriptive word of how many people feel today, is certain discontent. Could you give us a sneak peek into what you are touching upon in your book?
Oh, well, there are a couple of themes. It's written a lot for the United States, where what I emphasize is that the real source of wealth of a country is innovation, investment in people, and that a lot of the people who are wealthy get it from exploiting other people. So you shouldn't, and that just redistributes income, usually from poor to the top. So that you shouldn't confuse what makes a person wealthy and what makes a nation wealthy. So that's one theme in the book. And then to say that actually, if you look at what's happening in the United States, and there's a long history of the debate between two schools of thought in economics. One that talks about inequality as associated with exploitation of others, and another one talks about inequality as a result of some people making more of a contribution to society than others. Because those who study economics, marginal productivity theory, neoliberalism. And I come out very strongly that modern America is all about exploitation. And that, therefore, the last half of the book is about how do we reform capitalism, a market economy, in ways that make it more dynamic, more equitable, sort of more Norwegian-like, or Scandinavian-like, it, so that everyone, at least most people, have the prospects of having a decent middle-class life. And, in a way, what I argue, the relevance for other countries is that the United States has really become a model now of what not to do. So by studying America, you can study sort of, really the bad example. And, the kinds of things that are going on are really quite striking, that life expectancy in the United States has been going down. Here in the richest country, where we are doing breakthrough research in health, that life expectancy is in decline, and the incidence of poverty, the incidence of 40% of the wealth of the country goes to the top 1%. The wages at the bottom are the same as they were 60 years ago. So there's been no growth in wages for more than a half a century. And then you wonder at the end of that why there's discontent, and why somebody like Trump gets elected. You understand the economic system has not been working for a majority, I would say 90% of Americans. And then there's a political element in the book of, how did we get here?
Perhaps we could open up for some questions from some of the students. I'm sure you have a lot of questions on your mind. Great.
You talked about the need to repeat and redo stories and retell them to achieve impact. Going back to my same old problem here, and I would like to distinguish between journalism and communications for the sake of advocating for a change.
Yeah.
In PR or in communications, the dictum is to be on message, in volume, over time. That's how you get your message across. That's what PR people do. In journalism, the conundrum we're faced with is that we want to achieve the greatest impact of our story. We write it in the best way we can. We try and aim it at the public interest as best as we can. We try and publish it in the best publication for that story. And then we must decide after that, do we want to take another bite of that apple, or do we want to go and investigate the next thing that hasn't been investigated, and leave the advocacy for people who pick up on our information and believe that it should be advocated for? That can be analysts, that can be activists, that can be politicians. And that's how, that was the choice that we usually fell back on. We wanted to retell and push the story in different ways, but we felt that was advocating too hard. And it took away from other things that could be investigated, and there are other parts of society that can and should use journalism. And I think that there's an important distinction there.
That's so interesting because I feel like with Panama Papers, part of what made it so effective was they did find lots of ways to repackage it, right? So they were also doing the video of the clinic in Uganda that didn't have medicine because the government wasn't collecting tax revenues. And then they reminded us every time somebody resigned, you know, the Prime Minister of Iceland, or there was a prosecution, or another tax avoidance story, everybody remembered that it was the Panama Papers, and the Panama Papers were referred to. So I think there's lots of ways of kind of doing doing both. I mean, I guess you're saying if you just abandoned tax avoidance altogether and went to a whole different subject. But I feel like every time anyone does a tax avoidance story, it's very easy to sort of contextualize it and say, you know, a year later, what's been done, or we went back to those people's community and nothing's changed after 6 months. So, I feel that you can do both, and sort of give people fresh information while still staying on a topic. But you're saying the temptation was just to drop that topic and go do a totally different topic instead?
Not necessarily. So if I was to look at our Gupta coverage, which was over the course of a decade, that basically achieved that PR communications aim, and many of our critics thought that that's exactly what we were doing. But we weren't. We were working on other stories at the same time, and our editors would often come back to us and say, you know, you've written the story, nobody understands it, nobody cares. You need to retell it. You need to now do an analysis. You need to do a think piece. You need to find a different way to tell that piece. We were very tempted to do that. We wanted to do that. We thought we were in a good place to bring that, to bring good analysis to our readers. But there were other Gupta investigations to do, and we kicked back against our editors reluctantly, not wholeheartedly.
To break new ground.
And yeah, we wanted to break new ground, and it ultimately did achieve a goal. Other stories didn't, because we didn't follow the theme as strategically and as persistently over the years.
But it may not have been you. Like, I noticed journalists always blame themselves. But it may be, you know, right? Every time there's a problem, journalists say, oh, it was our fault. Like, if only we'd covered the people in the red states better, we wouldn't have had Trump. If only we'd gone up to Wales and found out what they were really thinking about Brexit. If only we'd have been tougher on those big banks, we should have seen it coming. But it may be that those stories that didn't have an impact as much, it may also have been other reasons besides the journalism, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the lawyers or the...
Yeah, but I think what Anya said is right, that usually these stories can be covered from many different angles. And part of the thing is you're trying to find out how people are perceiving things and what is going to get a reaction. And, you know, in a couple thousand words, you can't cover every angle. So the retelling the story with new information each time from a different angle. You know, take Trump tax story. You know, the fact that he's a tax avoider. Okay, everybody knows that. But there is a story, the excessively long story that they wrote about his inheritance taxes. That should have been broken down into many stories and looked at from many different angles. The story of the Russian money laundering that he's involved in has been written once.
A few times,
what?
A few times.
A couple of times, but not in the main newspapers. It tends to get journalistic because it gets long form and because it's in the past. But sort of linking some of the characters that he has more recently been involved in with some of the characters he was involved in the past makes it a news story. Yeah. So some of it is repeating over and over again, but some of it, you know, a lot of journalists are, as you said, are both trying to discover news, but also are in advocacy. I mean, that was the muckraking. They were really advocate, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that, as long as when you're doing the news story, you're not making up your story. It's fact checked. It's accurate. You're going in there because you think it makes a difference to have that story. And in that context, trying to get political figures to repeat this over and over again. Their job is advocacy and civil society. So one of the things that President Clinton said over and over again is you have to just keep repeating the same story over and over again. And his view was that don't be embarrassed about saying the same thing twice. You don't have to be original. You know, just talking a little bit to academics, you know, we feel uneasy saying the same thing twice. And he said, look, people don't hear you the first time, and you just have to say the same thing. Think about how do you say it again and again. But that's as a political figure in civil society. As a journalist, you can't quite write the same story twice, but you can write it from different angles and from different perspectives and told by different people and the impact at different places.
And as we know, lots of the problems don't go away, or they're huge, so it's hard to figure them out, describe them. Who else had a question? Let's take three in a group, because
Okay,
yeah,
let's do
and
three.
then we'll know.
My question starts from a starting point of maybe at least some of my friends and what I see as a general opinion of my quite progressive friends. They get a bit angry when this school changed its name to Oslo Met, or Oslome, as I call it, just for fun, because it's supposed to be English, but we're in Norway. And people get angry because of this, because it sounds commercialized, or I think that's some of the intention. And also our railway company that used to be Norwegian, but now it's privatized, is now called Vy, which is also like a trendy name.
Yeah.
And people get, or at least the left side in Norwegian politics gets a bit angry at this, or thinks it's stupid because we're moving in a commercial direction of our communications. And you touched a bit upon it, this behavioral economics, that maybe journalism isn't taking it on. And what I would like really to hear from both of you is what are the pros and cons for journalism taking this kind of PR tricks on? Can it hurt journalism, or is it needed to get across the most important stories for the audience?
Should we take all the questions?
I don't mind just
Or would you
answering
like
that. I
to
just
answer?
finished reading. By the way, everybody was complaining to us over the weekend about the train company changing its name, and we were all just laughing and stuff. It's like, I don't know how they always call them customers now instead of passengers and things like that. It's really annoying. Everybody thinks an annoying name change. I would say, because I know we have 3 questions, I'll briefly answer unless you have something to say, which is, I just finished reading Jill Abramson's new book, Merchants of Truth, which is totally fantastic, although she's been accused of not attributing some of her sources properly. But she has several chapters on what BuzzFeed did and what Vice did and what Mike did. And so their whole raison d'etre was to figure out how to make stories go viral and how to catch attention. And they did it really, really well. They divided all human emotion into 8 categories, and then they had subcategories. So they exactly knew how to write a headline. You know, and I'm sure you've talked about this in class, all the A/B testing. But I would say inevitably, that kind of attention to marketing has resulted in a cost to quality journalism. I mean, there's just no question in my mind that it leads to pandering. It's certainly necessary because you need to have audiences, and in the digital age you have to get attention. But all of that, native advertising, sponsored content, kind of virality has been destructive for journalism, I would say. But it's inevitable. And, you know, now in the whole sort of discussion of trust, which I know is a big deal in Norway, you know, there's various scholars like Mads Carlsen who really feel that this also contributed to the erosion of trust, right? Because people started to feel they couldn't tell what was good journalism, what was bad journalism, what was sort of marketing. So I'd say the answer to your question is yes, both. Did you have anything to add?
I wanted to add one thing, which is I think one of the topics of journalism is language and how language shapes the way we perceive things. I mean, that's what we do. We use words. And taking the state out of what we name various
really
things
bad.
is an attempt to reframe society and make it is an assault on government and the
And that's
role
what
of
happened
government.
in the U.S. and the states that didn't want to call, Obamacare. They called it Kentucky Care, Tennessee Care. And when it came time for the elections, people voted for Trump because they didn't understand their health care had come from the federal government.
Yeah, so
It's dangerous, actually.
A famous thing was, episode was where somebody said, "I want to keep government out of my Medicare," when Medicare was a government program.
Social Security.
And they thought that, they've been taught that if it's a government program, it can't be good. They knew that Medicare and Social Security were good, therefore they couldn't be a government program. So, in a way, the making people aware of that your efficient tram is a public utility is important, and the attempt to get rid of the name is a political issue. And the same thing, Statoil. The reason it's the most efficient and the only clean oil company and gas company in the world, and not that you can have any clean, but cleaner than any of the others, is because it's state-run. And it's the only one that's been fighting for good regulation in the United States. And to take away the role of the state in the performance is a mistake.
Cool. So there was a question with stripey and then red, and then we'll stop.
It's also on how to get your message across, or your story across. I'm wondering whether it could help if local newspapers would focus more on investigative journalism. If investigative journalists would cooperate with local newspapers to cover local stories. Because that's something I feel like people can relate to more, because they feel, okay, it really affects their daily life.
Yeah. Well, I think that in Norway you do have a substantial amount of investigative journalism being done by local newspapers. At least that's what I've been hearing over the weekend. And maybe it doesn't seem like a lot for Norway, but compared to other places, it's probably more. The fact is, investigative journalism, I've done it for local newspapers, can also be very controversial. I mean, there's always people that don't like it. And in small communities, people can get very angry hearing things that they don't want to hear. But right now in the U.S., as we're trying to understand, how did Trump win and what role did the media play, there's definitely one school of thought which has emerged, which is there's no local news anymore. Everybody's watching Fox. They're getting all this propaganda. It's been documented that Fox leads to Republican voting. So if we had more local news, maybe people would watch that and listen to that instead of watching Fox. I actually agree with Emily Bell at Columbia, who argues that it's two different problems. So we have a problem that people are getting lied to all the time by Fox, loving it, believing it, and voting Republican. And we also have a huge problem that we don't have investigative reporting or local news anymore. I don't think adding local news back, if we can, will solve the other problem, but definitely more needs to be done. And it's not being done because there's absolutely no way to make any money out of it.